Hey guys, picture this. You're standing in a blinding desert night where the sky rips open like a ripped-off curtain, and a smoky voice rattles through the dunes, promising apocalyptic fire and oddly specific fashion advice. Welcome to Isaiah's first vision. Before we wander any further, smash that like button if you love a good prophetic rant, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Maybe you're in a city apartment or a real-life desert. We won't judge. Now dim the lights, grab your most uncomfortable cushion, and let the air grow as dry as an old scroll. You feel the grit of sand under your boots, hear the rustle of ancient parchment, and smell the metallic tang of divine incense that makes you wonder if your incense stick just died a tragic death. It's funny how a guy from the 8th century kingdom of Judah talked about the day the Lord will turn the world upside down, while probably worrying about getting his sandals back from the laundry. Yeah, divine drama meets everyday dread. So stick around, because we're about to unpack why Isaiah's cryptic warnings still echo in our Wi-Fi filled lives. And let me know in the comments if you've ever felt a warning whisper in the wind. Isaiah stepped into the temple's inner sanctuary, the cool marble floor slick with the sweat of 100 pilgrim prayers. The incense thickened the air, a honey-sweet fog that clung to his throat like a warm blanket. Suddenly, a voice cracked through the holy hush, louder than the shofar blast at Yom Kippur, shaking the golden menorah as if it were a cheap speaker on a concert stage. Isaiah's heart hammered. His palm brushed the rough stone altar and felt the ancient dust of generations grind under his fingers. He froze, half expecting a celestial courier in a robe, but only the echo of divine thunder answered his startled stare. The voice demanded, without apology, that the young priest become a messenger to a nation that had taken the covenant for a casual TikTok trend. Brief, flashy, and quickly forgotten, it warned of famine that would taste like ash, of cities crumbling like overcooked toast left too long in a desert oven. Yet it also whispered a sliver of hope, a promise of restoration brighter than the sunrise over the Dead Sea, if only the people would turn back. Isaiah felt the weight of prophecy settle on his shoulders, solid as a priest's stone vestments, yet oddly lightened by the absurdity of delivering ancient doom in a world that now scrolls scrolls. He swallowed, tasting the metallic sting of fear mixed with the sweet resolve of a hero in an old-school epic, ready to carry the message. With a steady breath, Isaiah stepped out of the sanctuary, the stone walls echoing his determination like a drum roll before a battle. He caught the scent of market spices, cumin, and the faint musk of donkey dung, reminding him that his audience wasn't perched on lofty thrones but bent over grinding wheat. He raised his voice in the bustling courtyard, his words cutting through chatter like a laser sword through a paper scroll, delivering both warning and the promise of a future healed. The crowd's reaction was a mix of smirks, sighs, and the occasional eye roll, as if they'd heard the same old story in a Netflix reboot. Yet the tremor of truth lingered. Isaiah walked away, his robe rustling, feeling the divine thunder still humming in his bones, confident that even a reluctant nation can hear a prophet when the sound is loud enough. In a vision that struck like a sudden gust of desert sand, Isaiah beheld Jerusalem as a ruined ghost town, its walls cracked, and its streets choked with ash that smelled like burnt incense and stale bread. The city's once bright gates now creaked like rusty hinges, echoing the sighs of abandoned children and the mournful cries of lonely pigeons. A sudden wind scattered the dust, briefly revealing shattered statues of lions that looked more like broken Lego pieces than regal beasts. Isaiah felt the weight of divine judgment settle on his shoulders, a pressure as palpable as a heavyweight champion's purse string. He turned his eyes toward the throne room, ready to shake the king's complacent grin with a prophetic jab as sharp as a sword-toothed smile. The clouds then swirled apart, unveiling a Zion reborn, bathed in a golden glow that made the river sparkle like liquid honey in a sunrise Instagram reel. Towering trees burst forth, their leaves humming with a fragrance of fresh pine and ripe figs that tickled the nose and lifted the spirit. Children laughed, their voices ringing like silver bells, while the streets glittered with marble so smooth it felt like stepping on a giant's polished skateboard. Even the temples shone, their altars gleaming with fire that was warm, not wrathful, inviting worshippers to dance like they were at a celestial rave. Isaiah tasted hope on his tongue, a sweet tang of figs and wine that made the earlier doom feel as outdated as a dial-up modem. Awakened by the clash of ruin and redemption, Isaiah marched to the palace, his sandals kicking up dust as he confronted the king, whose crown glittered like a cheap costume prop in a superhero parody. He slapped the priest's robes with a rhetorical slapstick, reminding them that incense alone won't clean a nation's filthy conscience. The common folk gathered, eyes wide, as Isaiah spoke in a voice that rippled like a drumbeat, mixing stern warning with a wink-worthy promise of future feasts. Laughter bubbled from the crowd when he compared the city's future to a blockbuster sequel. The sequel's better, folks, because the villain finally gets what's coming. By the time the sun set, the city's walls still bore scars, but a faint, resilient glow lingered, promising that judgment and hope could dance together in the same cramped alleyway. The marble corridors of Samaria thrummed with hushed conspiracies as courtiers whispered behind gilt-edged doors. Isaiah, scroll tucked under his arm, slipped into the throne room where Ahaz sat on a throne that smelled of incense and old sweat. The king's eyes flickered like lanterns in a storm, scanning for any hint of rebellion. With a voice that cut through the perfume and politicking, Isaiah announced that the kingdom was teetering on a razor-thin edge. The courtiers stiffened, their silk robes rustling like dry leaves, while a lone sparrow tapped against the stone window. Isaiah leaned forward, his fingers tracing the edge of the prophecy like a guitarist finding the right chord, and warned that an Assyrian horde would march like a wall of iron drums. He told Ahaz to drop the glittering treaties with Egypt and Babylon, saying trusting foreign gods was like hiring a reality TV star to guard the city, flashy but useless. The king chuckled, his laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling, yet the scent of spiced wine lingered, masking his doubt. Isaiah's eyes blazed. He reminded the monarch that the true shield was a covenant, not a bronze armory, and that God's fire could melt even the sharpest spearheads. A courtier whispered, "Better pray than panic," as the distant clang of distant drums grew louder in the night. When Ahaz turned his back, conspirators seized Isaiah, dragging him through a courtyard slick with rain-soaked mud and the iron tang of blood. They beat him with whips that hissed like serpents, yet the prophet's lips never quivered, his faith as stubborn as a mule refusing a carrot. Despite the bruises blooming across his skin, Isaiah shouted verses that rose like incense, filling the night with a scent that made the aggressors pause, bewildered. The king's guards, hearing the holy words, hesitated, their armor clanking like reluctant drums, and a shiver of irony swept through the palace. Those who tried to silence the messenger only amplified his echo. In the end, Isaiah stood, bloodied but unbowed, his eyes fixed on the horizon where a sunrise promises redemption, and he whispered, "Even Netflix can't stream a miracle like this." Isaiah stands on the cracked stone steps of the temple, the heat of the noon sun baking the sand beneath his sandals. He lifts his trembling voice above the murmuring crowd, a rustle of goat skins and incense swirling like ghostly ribbons. With a dramatic flick of his cloak, he declares that the age of idle prayers ends now, and a new figure will rise from the dust. The listeners lean in, their eyes wide as the horizon, while a stray camel bleats in the background, punctuating the tension. He whispers, half in awe, half in warning, that this man will carry the weight of a nation's sins like a sack of sour grapes. The suffering servant steps onto the scene, not in shining armor but in threadbare linen stained with blood and sweat. His hands are cracked, his feet blistered from walking the scorching road, yet he walks on, each footfall echoing like a drumbeat of sorrow. Isaiah paints him as a bruised hero who drinks the bitterness of betrayal, tasting ash and vinegar on his tongue, while the people watch, half horrified, half fascinated. A goat's mournful bleat rises, mirroring the servant's own groan, and the air smells of burnt offerings and wet earth. Ironically, the crowd jokes that even the prophets needed a spa day after witnessing such pain, but the servant's silent stare crushes the laughter. In the shadows of the altar, Isaiah proclaims that this suffering will carve a path to redemption, as if a scar could become a road map to hope. He gestures toward the sunrise spilling gold over the city walls, the light catching dust motes like tiny fireflies dancing to a funeral hymn. The crowd feels a shiver, a mix of dread and wonder, as the servant's wounds begin to glow, promising salvation in the most uncomfortable of ways. Isaiah's words reverberate, promising that the nation will drink from a cup of sorrow, only to find it sweetened with forgiveness. And as the last echo fades, someone mutters that even Netflix couldn't script a drama this intense, proving that ancient prophecy still has the best binge-watch material. Isaiah stands amid the smoky ruins of Jerusalem, his voice cracking like an old vinyl record as he declares a new covenant. He pictures a river of living water splashing over broken stones, the scent of fresh figs and myrrh filling the air. The prophet's eyes flash with the fire of 1,000 sunrise, promising that God will write the law not on tablets, but on hearts that beat like drum machines. A tentative grin spreads across his face as he imagines the people dancing in the streets, their sandals kicking up dust that smells of renewal. The exiles storm the harbor like a binge-watch marathon, ships slamming against the pier with the roar of a stadium crowd. Their faces are sun-baked and scarred, carrying the weight of Babylonian bureaucracy and the sweet smell of cumin from their market stalls. When they step onto the cracked cobbles, the city shivers, and a chorus of goats bleats, as if the heavens themselves are laughing at the irony of home sweet home. Children chase each other around the altar, their laughter cutting through the mournful clang of blacksmiths hammering new swords for peace. Even the old priests, draped in tattered robes, sigh in relief, whispering that the covenant's reboot feels like a software update, annoying but necessary. Isaiah's words seep into the stone walls, lingering like the bitter aftertaste of black coffee on a cold morning. Generations later, scribes and scholars clutch his scrolls, feeling the electric buzz of his prophecy as if it were a vintage mixtape playing on a modern speaker. The counsel he offers, justice, mercy, humility, stabs the heart of tyrants with the sharpness of a freshly forged blade, a reminder that power can be as fragile as parchment. In taverns and temples alike, his verses echo, guiding rebels, poets, and even meme makers who sprinkle number covenant goals across their feeds. The legacy endures, a stubborn scent of incense and sweat that refuses to be snuffed out, proving that a prophet's hope can outlast even the most stubborn sandstorm. The market clamor of Jerusalem roared like a restless chariot, merchants hawking figs and copper. Isaiah, a lithe priest with ink-stained robes, slipped between stone pillars, his sandals kicking up dust that smelled of incense and spilled wine. He was humming a psalm when a breath-tight hush fell over the courtyard, as if the city had pressed the mute button on the gossip. A courier in a threadbare tunic slapped a sealed scroll into his hand, its seal a simple olive branch that meant urgent. Isaiah cracked it open and read, "Come swiftly to the temple's heart. Your presence is needed." He rushed to the temple courtyard, where the air tasted of burnt offering smoke and hot metal from the bronze altar. There, perched on a throne that glimmered like a sapphire night sky, sat a figure whose radiance made the bronze shine like a cheap disco ball. Around the throne swirled 6 winged seraphim whose feathers flickered with ember gold, and their chorus rose, "Holy, holy, holy," as if the heavens were doing a karaoke version of All That Glitters. The sound vibrated through Isaiah's ribs, sending a shiver that felt like a cold draft from a medieval cellar. He stared, heart thudding, as the vision's light hit his eyes and turned the dust motes into tiny, glittering fireworks. Isaiah's mind did a cartwheel, part awestruck, part panic, like a teen at a surprise concert who just realized the front row is a holy throne. He felt both humbled and insulted, as if the divine had RSVP'd to a party he hadn't even known he was invited to. Yet within the blaze he sensed a thread of hope, a warm ember that whispered, "You are not alone in the chaos of this city." He laughed, a thin, nervous chuckle that sounded like a cracked lyre, because even prophets need a giggle when the cosmos drops a cameo. With the vision seared into his memory, Isaiah turned back toward the temple doors, ready to translate that dazzling horror into words that would echo through generations. Isaiah stalks the cracked stone lanes of Jerusalem like a lone detective in a noir flick, the memory of the heavenly throne still flashing behind his eyes. The market stalls exhale a stew of incense, sweat, and simmering goat cheese, while the distant clang of blacksmiths sounds like a broken metronome. Every doorway hides a God-made idol, its golden eyes glittering like cheap costume jewelry at a Comic-Con after-party. He inhales the acrid smoke of burnt offerings, feeling the ash sting his throat as if the city itself were coughing. The vision gnaws at him, a restless ghost that refuses to leave the tavern of his mind. Suddenly a serpent, slick as a neon-lit skateboard trick, slips through the piles of charred incense, its scales flashing a cynical grin. It coils around the smoldering ashes, hissing a challenge that sounds oddly like a busted Wi-Fi signal. No connection. The beast's cold tongue brushes the altar, stirring up a perfume of bone dust and rotten figs that makes Isaiah's stomach churn. Passers-by glance away, their eyes glazed with the same devotion that keeps their feet glued to the ground, as if they're watching a horror movie in which the monster is their own complacency. Isaiah curses the creature, and, with a rueful laugh, wonders if even a snake could be more faithful than his people. He stops beneath a cracked column, the sun punching through the dusty clouds like a spotlight on a stage, and asks aloud whether the glory that once painted the heavens can still cut through this murky gloom. The answer seems to echo off the stone, a mix of distant trumpets and the distant murmur of gossiping women trading gossip like memes. A sudden gust sweeps the ashes into a spiraling vortex, momentarily revealing the faint outline of a radiant figure, God's own Instagram filter, over the ruined shrine. Isaiah's heart pounds, half terrified, half exhilarated, as if he'd just been handed a backstage pass to the ultimate concert. With a grin that tastes of ash and hope, he swears to carry the vision forward, daring the darkness to try its luck against a light that refuses to dim. The night in Jerusalem roared like a market gone wild, drums of unrest beating against the stone walls. Suddenly, the Holy One slipped through the veil, his presence hotter than a summer grill, and a flaming sword sang across the courtyard, its edge a comet of fire. The blade kissed the altar, turning soot and ash into a crisp, coppery scent that rose like incense on a windy pier. Isaiah felt the heat strike his chest, a spark that made his heart pound faster than a tick-tock dance beat. He stared, half in awe, half in disbelief, as the holy blaze turned the Holy of Holies into a furnace of fresh hope. Sweat dripped down Isaiah's brow, and his mind tangled like a knot of cords behind a stage rig. He whispered doubts into the silence, wondering if the fire was a warning or a cosmic barbecue invitation from the Almighty. Yet as the flames licked the bronze, they revealed a hidden pattern, a phoenix-like promise that the old sacrificial smoke would rise anew, clean and bright. The heat seared his fear, but also forged resolve, as sturdy as a blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron. With each crackle, Isaiah laughed a nervous laugh, half choking on the smoky air, realizing even the divine can throw a little pyrotechnics for good measure. When the fire finally dimmed, the temple glowed with a soft amber, like the afterglow of a sunset filtered through stained glass. Isaiah stepped forward, his cloak brushing the warm stones, feeling the echo of the sword's song vibrating in his bones. He lifted his voice, declaring that the cleansing fire was not a punishment, but a new playlist for the nation, an anthem of renewal that would drown out the clamor of chaos. The people who had watched the blaze with wide eyes began to clap, their cheers ringing like a stadium crowd after a buzzer beater. Filled with holy vigor, Isaiah marched out, his heart still humming with the holy flame, ready to write the next chapter of hope. The night in the temple crackled like a busted neon sign, the air thick with incense and the smell of damp stone. When the Holy One stepped forward, his voice rolled over the crowd like a thunderclap wrapped in silk, announcing a covenant of everlasting light. He lifted a glowing staff, and the light spilled onto the shattered altar, turning the broken tiles into mirrors of hope. Isaiah felt the floor tremble under his sandals, each vibration a reminder that history was being redrawn. Even the guards, usually stone-faced, cracked a grin that reminded him of a sitcom punchline. From the gnarled stump of Israel, more twisted than a pretzel at a carnival, sprouted a single righteous branch, bright as a superhero's cape. The branch unfurled leaves that whispered promises of peace and justice, rustling like the gentle hum of a 90s video game soundtrack. Skeptics scoffed, muttering that a lone twig could tame war, but the branch's scent, spicy cedar with a hint of fresh rain, filled the courtyard, silencing doubt. As the people gathered, the air buzzed with a strange mix of relief and the electric thrill of a new season premiere. The irony was delicious. A battered nation finding its redemption in something that looked like a decorative Christmas tree. Then the Holy One's voice cut through the murmurs. Your people will be called the redeemed of the Lord. And Isaiah felt destiny slam onto his shoulders like a heavyweight champion's glove. The words lingered, heavy with the weight of every exile, every shattered promise, and every silent prayer that smelled of burnt offering and stale bread. Isaiah's heart hammered, his throat dry as desert dust, yet a fierce fire flickered behind his eyes, bright enough to outshine the candle-lit shadows. He turned to the crowd, their faces a mosaic of hope and disbelief, and knew he stood at the edge of a new dawn, ready to shout the prophecy like a rallying cry at a rock concert. The promise settled over him, warm and radiant, like stepping into the first sunrise after a night of endless storms. Isaiah slipped back through the city gates like a traveler with a fresh battery of prophecy, his cloak still dusted with the desert's amber sand. He climbed the rickety steps of the market square and shouted, "Listen up, you tired souls." A voice that rolled over broken roofs like thunder on an old vinyl record. The crowd, half asleep and half hungry, turned their eyes to the prophet as if he were the only Wi-Fi hotspot in town. With every breath he painted the vision of the Holy One, spilling light into alleys where moldy laundry hung like ghosts. Laughter cracked the gloom when a baker muttered that Isaiah's hope smelled better than his overproofed dough, and the people leaned in, hungry for the promise. Soon the weary began to gather ash-streaked bricks, chanting the same verses Isaiah had sung, their hands raw from the gritty mortar. Children chased each other between columns, the scent of spiced incense mixing with the sharp tang of fresh-cut stone, a paradox that felt oddly comforting. Even the cynic tavern owner, who usually swore off any holy hype, raised his mug and toasted, to hope, now with fewer potholes. Men and women patched torn prayers into the walls, stitching broken faith into a tapestry as vivid as a superhero cape fluttering in a desert wind. By night, lanterns flickered like tiny constellations, and the city's sigh turned into a low rumble of collective restoration. At dawn, the first light spilled over the temple's shattered facade, turning cracked stone into a glittering mosaic of gold dust. The sun rose like an ancient Instagram filter, bathing the courtyard in a glow that made the shadows retreat in embarrassed silence. Isaiah stood on the steps, his eyes reflecting the blaze, and whispered that the Holy One's glory outlasts every nighttime nightmare. The crowd inhaled the cool morning air, tasting the sweet promise of renewal on their tongues, while the distant clang of hammers sang a hymn of rebuilding. As the city awoke, its heartbeat synced with the sunrise, a living testament that even in the deepest dark, light always finds a way to crash the party. Isaiah shuffled along the limestone tiles of the temple courtyard, his sandals kicking up dust like a late-night DJ scratching vinyl. The incense burners puffed sweet, heavy smoke that clung to his skin, while the clamor of merchants and the occasional shout of a child playing tag echoed off the sandstone walls. He paused by the bronze laver, wiping his forearms on the rough stone, and glanced up at the towering pillars that seemed to lean in on him like a gossiping ant. The priest in training felt a curious mix of reverence and teenage boredom, as if he were on the ancient equivalent of a grocery store break room shift. Suddenly, a breeze that smelled of barley and burnt offering swirled around him, making the priest think the heavens were pulling a prank. Out of the shimmering air stepped an angelic messenger, its wings flickering like neon billboards on a rainy night, and eyes that glowed brighter than a morning market sunrise. The figure spoke in a voice that ricocheted off the courtyard stones, announcing a future draped in shadows. War drums, famine and weeping, mothers clutching empty cradles. Yet between the terror, the messenger dropped a cryptic hint about a hidden hero who would drink the nation's sins like a strong cup of coffee, bitter but necessary for waking up. Isaiah felt his heart thud like a drumbeat, part awe, part dread, as the sight of cracked, blood-stained altar stones flashed before his eyes. The angel's words hung in the air, a paradox of doom and daring hope, as if the universe had just posted a spoiler for its own drama. The angel introduced the suffering servant, a figure described in hushed, almost sarcastic tones, as if the divine were trolling the crowds with a rock star who'd take all the hits while sipping sacramental wine. This servant would bear the weight of every broken covenant, every whispered accusation, and every scar on the nation's collective conscience, turning agony into redemption like a master chef turning sour lemons into a sweet tart. Isaiah watched the vision unfold, a lone silhouette kneeling on cracked earth, blood seeping into the dust, while distant horns sang a mournful lullaby that somehow felt comforting. The prophet sensed that this was not just prophecy, but an invitation to stand beside the suffering, to become a bridge between divine wrath and human mercy. With a mixture of awe and a grin that bordered on disbelief, Isaiah realized he'd just been handed the ultimate plot twist, one that would echo through centuries like a timeless meme. When the night fell over Jerusalem, Isaiah sat on the cold stone steps of the temple, the smell of burnt offering still clinging to his robes. A vision flickered like a desert fire, a lone figure, cloaked in ragged flesh, bearing a crown of thorns that seemed to glow against the ash. The prophet felt the weight of that image press into his ribs, a pressure as real as the bronze door he had just slammed shut. He swallowed a sigh that tasted like sour figs, wondering whether the heavens had just handed him a script no one would buy. Yet the echo of that suffering servant whispered through his teeth, promising a story even the king's messengers would have to retell. The next morning, Isaiah marched into the council chamber, where high priests preened like peacocks and merchants swaggered with their polished sandals. He unfurled his scroll, and the room filled with the rustle of parchment, sound sharper than a tick-tock notification in a silent monastery. "You speak of a servant who suffers," scoffed the chief priest, his eyebrows arching higher than the city walls, as if Isaiah had suggested the Assyrians were just extra background extras. Isaiah replied with a wry grin, pointing at the altar's blood-stained stone and saying, "Even the best-selling superhero needs a tragic origin, my friend." The laughter that followed was a thin veneer over a deeper unease, and Isaiah felt his own doubts crawl up his spine like a cold cobra. By dusk, the distant rumble of Assyrian war drums rolled over the hills, a thunder that smelled of sweat and leather armor, shaking the shutters of every house. Isaiah stood on the city walls, the wind scraping his beard, and sang a new song, words that stitched together the vision of the suffering servant with the looming siege. His voice rose over the clamor, each line a thread of hope weaving through the iron-clad fear that threatened to swallow Jerusalem whole. As arrows whistled past, the scent of spiced lamb from the nearby market mingled with the acrid sting of smoke, reminding him that life, painful, messy, glorious, still churned below. In that moment, the prophet understood the paradox. The servant's wound would become the city's shield, a bittersweet promise that even the fiercest invader could not silence. Jerusalem groans under a sky that smells of dry figs and ash. The market stalls emptied like a sitcom set after the laugh track stops. Famine gnaws at the belly of the city, and the scent of cracked wheat and bitter oil fills every alleyway. Families huddle around smoldering hearths, their faces lit by flickering flames that whisper of exile and loss. Isaiah walks the stone streets, hearing the clatter of empty plates and the muttered curses of a people turned into reluctant actors in a tragedy they never auditioned for. He sees a child clutching a cracked biscuit, as if it were a relic from a better episode of life. In the midst of that gloom, a shadow slips through the crowd, moving with the quiet confidence of a superhero who skipped the origin story. Isaiah catches a flash of the servant's cloak, rough as camel hide, yet somehow radiating a promise that feels like the first chord of a rock anthem. The murmurs rise, half-hearted and ironic, as folk joke, maybe the Savior will finally bring Wi-Fi to the desert. Yet the air shivers with a new scent, sweet myrrh mingling with the old dust, hinting that redemption is not a myth but a stubborn plant breaking through cracked pavement. Isaiah's heart hammers like a tribal drum, realizing the servant is both a beacon and a rebel, ready to rewrite the nation's script. With the sun sinking behind the crumbling walls, Isaiah climbs the temple steps, his voice gravelly from the dust but bright with urgency. He urges the people to trust the unseen deliverer, comparing faith to holding onto a stubborn mop handle while the whole house floods. "Even if the road ahead smells like burnt offerings," he shouts, "the servant will turn our sorrow into a feast fit for a king, no more midnight snacks of despair." The crowd, eyes glistening with tears and a smidge of sarcastic hope, begins to chant, their voices rising like storm cloud drums. As night cloaks the city, the promise lingers, a silent promise that even the deepest famine can't starve a spirit that's been fed on stubborn hope. The night air in Jerusalem trembled with the clamor of marching boots and the metallic clang of distant siege engines. But Isaiah stood on a cracked stone platform, his cloak rustling like weary parchment. He lifted his weather-worn scroll, and his voice cut through the din, fierce as a trumpet at a rock concert opening. Around him, the crowd smelled of sweat, ash, and the sharp bite of spilled wine, a cocktail that made every breath feel heavy. With a half-smirk, Isaiah joked that the Lord's messenger was no longer a silent prophet, but a hype man for the divine, sending ripples of curiosity through the assembled soldiers. The sky, bruised purple, seemed to lean in, waiting for the words that would change the war's script. Then Isaiah sang the servant songs, painting a humble figure whose skin was pocked with wounds like a battered chariot after a desert rally. The servant bore bruises not for his own sins, but for the nation's transgressions, each scar a tiny billboard advertising divine mercy. He was described as pierced for our rebellion, yet his eyes glittered with a gentle humor, as if he'd just seen a cat steal a priest's sandal. The imagery was gritty, blood seeping into sand, a raw, metallic scent of iron mingling with the sweet incense of hope, making listeners feel both ache and relief. In that paradox, the crowd heard a promise. The bruised healer would stitch up the nation's torn flesh with the very thorns that once pricked it. As the last note faded, a hush settled over the battlefield, broken only by the distant groan of a collapsing wall and the soft rustle of hopeful prayers. The promise of the suffering servant rippled through the ranks like a meme that finally went viral, turning hardened warriors into tentative believers. A sunrise broke, spilling amber light that warmed the cold stone and lifted the scent of fresh figs, a reminder that even war-torn streets could taste sweet again. Isaiah's words became the soundtrack for a new chapter, a Marvel-style reveal where the quiet hero steps onto the stage after the credits roll, bruises gleaming like medals. In that moment, the nation felt the divine promise unfurl, a banner of healing fluttering above the chaos, sealing the prophecy with a grin that said, "You've seen nothing yet." Isaiah stands on the crumbling steps of Jerusalem's temple, dust swirling like powdered sugar on a donut in a windstorm. He lifts his voice, a deep baritone that rolls over the rooftops and rattles the cracked stone arches. The servant, bruised and blood-soaked, bends the ancient altar, his sacrifice cracking open like a stubborn walnut under a hammer. The crowd gasps as the offering spills, the scent of burnt incense mingling with iron, and a whisper of a new covenant flickers brighter than a smartphone screen in a desert night. In that cracked stone, hope snaps awake, humming louder than the market vendors shouting about figs. When the exiles hear the call, they pack their rickety wagons, the smell of goat cheese and salt water mixing in the wind as if a culinary showdown were about to commence. Ships creak like old vinyl records as they slice through the Mediterranean, their sails snapping to a rhythm that could rival any EDM drop. The people step onto the promised land soil, feeling its grit between tired toes, and they laugh, thinking they've finally escaped the worst reality TV show ever, Exile Island. Priests light incense that curls like dragon smoke, while children chase each other, their shouts echoing off cracked walls. Isaiah watches, his eyes twinkling, as the promised restoration unfurls like a banner at a rock concert. Generations later, the story of the suffering servant swirls in campfires, a flame that never dims, casting warm shadows on eager faces. Elders tell it to toddlers while the scent of spiced stew simmers, each retelling stitching hope tighter than grandma's knitted shawl. Scholars scroll through tablets, marveling that the covenant still holds, like a cosmic Wi-Fi that never drops despite stormy clouds. Even skeptics can't help but feel a tug in their chest, as if an ancient drumbeat is nudging them toward forgiveness. Thus, hope rests not on a distant promise, but on a living, breathing promise that hums through the ages, louder than any stadium chant. In the waning year of King Uzziah's reign, the air in Jerusalem crackled like static before a storm. Isaiah was jolted awake by a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city. Before his eyes rose a bleak temple, its once golden pillars reduced to soot-black ash, the scent of burnt incense mingling with dust. The sight felt like walking into an abandoned movie set where the director had called cut, but never lifted the curtain. Even the stone walls whispered, "We're out of business." From the gloom drifted a celestial scroll, unfurling with the glow of a neon billboard on a rainy night. Its ink glowed brighter than any royal seal, spelling out judgment in bold, unrelenting script. Isaiah read the words as if the heavens were sending a group text. Your sins have pinged the divine inbox, and the reply is imminent. The scroll's voice rang like a war drum, each syllable reverberating against the cracked floor mosaics. Ironically, the divine message sounded less like a sermon, and more like a cosmic spoiler alert. The people of Judah gathered in the market square, clutching figs and gossip like they'd clutch a spoiler for the next episode of their lives. Fear flickered in their eyes, a nervous grin playing on the faces of those who thought the judgment might be postponed, like a streaming service delaying a new season. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice rough as cracked leather, reminding them that the scroll's promise was sealed tighter than any royal contract. The crowd felt the weight of impending reckoning settle like a heavy cloak of incense smoke on a summer night. Yet beneath the dread, a spark of stubborn hope twitched, as if someone whispered, maybe the ending isn't as bleak as the trailer suggests. Isaiah slipped past Jerusalem's stone walls, the heat of the desert clinging to his cloak like a stubborn sandstorm. He crossed the trembling plains of Damascus, where the wind carried the wail of mothers whose children were chained to foreign swords. The market streets stank of burnt incense and blood-soaked figs, and a chorus of anguished cries rose from the ruins of Nineveh like a broken record. A weary trader thrust a muddy jar of water into Isaiah's hands, whispering, "Our gods have turned their backs, but the Almighty still watches." Isaiah's heart hammered as he tasted the grit of desperation, realizing the nation's lament was not a distant echo but a roar at his very doorstep. As the sun bled red over the citadel, Isaiah saw that the same ruthless decree that felled Israel now gnawed at Assyria's golden halls. The king's chariots creaked like an overcooked skateboard, a painful reminder that power is as flimsy as a pop-up ad on a smartphone. He heard the scribes mutter that divine wrath was a local problem, only to watch a veil of ash settle over their banquet tables, smothering the feast. With a sigh that could have moved the desert dunes, Isaiah grasped the irony. God's judgment does not play favorites, it's the ultimate reality TV. No cutaways, just raw consequence. The prophet felt the weight of every shattered covenant, a bitter perfume of ash and oil that whispered, even your neighbors are in the line. Isaiah lifted his voice, letting it roll over the hills like a thunderous drumbeat, urging every tribe to turn their eyes toward the one who never forgets. He painted a picture of redemption as bright as a sunrise over the Euphrates, where the broken chains would melt into golden threads of hope. "Trust," he shouted, "for even the desert fox knows that the rain will come. God's faithfulness is the ultimate spoiler that always delivers the happy ending." The crowd, half stunned, half chuckling at the prophet's cheeky analogy, felt a shiver of warmth creep beneath their tattered cloaks. In that moment, the cry of the nations turned from a sorrowful lament into a chorus of tentative applause, a gritty song of redemption humming through the dust. Isaiah stood on the cracked stone steps of the sanctuary as a chorus of priests barked accusations, their robes rustling like dead leaves in a windless desert. The air reeked of burnt offerings and sweat, mingling with the metallic bite of swords that the kingdom's guards had slung at his heels. He felt the cold stone seeping through his sandals, reminding him that even the ground was unsympathetic. A skeptical king, perched on a throne that looked more like a throne seat from a medieval video game, sneered, "What faith can save you from my decree?" The prophet's heart thudded like a drum, yet the echo of an old promise whispered beneath the clamor. Inside his chest, doubt rose like a smoky ember, flickering whenever a priest's leer cut sharper than a razor blade. He imagined himself as the reluctant hero in a binge-watch thriller, stuck between divine subtitles and political spin talk, and laughed bitterly at the irony that his own words seemed to get lost in the echo chamber of power. Yet the scent of cedar incense, thick and sweet, carried a memory of a covenant sealed in ancient fire, a reminder that God's faithfulness never takes a day off. Isaiah pressed his palm to the cold altar, feeling the grain of the wood as if it were a pulse, and whispered, "Even if the world spins like a broken record, the divine promise stays in tune." A shiver of resolve shot through him, louder than any royal proclamation. With each breath, Isaiah let the lament turn into a song of trust, his voice rising above the clamor like a reed in a storm-blown marsh. He imagined the covenant as a sturdy wagon wheel, creaking under the weight of kings but never snapping, rolling forward on the dusty road of history. The priest's sneers dissolved into distant murmurs as the scent of rain on sun-baked mud filled his nostrils, promising renewal beyond the bitter present. He lifted his eyes to the heavens, where a crimson twilight painted the hills, and declared, "I will stand where the faithful have stood, because God's faithfulness is the only armor that won't rust." The crowd fell silent, not out of fear, but because the prophet's resolve had become a fire that even the coldest stone could not smother. The night air in Jerusalem hung heavy with incense and ash, as Isaiah stepped onto the stone platform, his cloak swaying like a weather-worn banner. Crowds muttered, half expecting thunder, half ready for another doom song, their sandals scuffing the dusty ground. He lifted his voice, a low rumble that cut through the clamor, and declared that the wheel of judgment was turning toward a brighter horizon. Behind him, the temple's bronze doors creaked open, spilling a warm, oil-scented breeze that seemed to whisper, "Hold on, something's changing." Even the old guard, who wore their skepticism like a leather armor, cracked a half-smile, because who could resist a prophet promising a plot twist? The promised branch, Isaiah said, would sprout from the soil of the oppressed, its leaves shimmering with the same green as a fresh-cut lawn after a rainstorm. Swords, once gleaming with blood-stained steel, would be tossed into the fire and reforged into plowshares that sang a soft, earthy thud as they turned furrows. Imagine a battlefield turned into a farmer's market, where the iron clang of cannons is replaced by the rhythmic clatter of harvest carts, like swapping a heavy metal concert for an acoustic jam session. The scent of fresh earth would rise, mixing with the lingering aroma of burnt incense, creating a perfume that tasted of hope and freshly baked bread. Even the desert wines, known for their cruelty, would pause to grin, as if saying, "Finally, a good plot twist. No more drama, just a good old-fashioned home makeover." As the vision unfurled, a hush settled over the crowd, thicker than the wool of a shepherd's coat, and a collective breath held the promise of sunrise. People felt the trembling of their own hearts, the thump of anticipation echoing like a drumbeat in a stadium before the final goal. Isaiah's words painted a new dawn where the sky blazed amber, the air sang with the chirps of sparrows, and the land glowed with a peace that tasted like honeyed tea. In that moment, judgment turned into redemption, and every weary soul sensed that the divine carpenter was about to nail together a world built on trust, not terror. So they left the platform, sandals dusty but spirits bright, ready to plant seeds under a sunrise that promised, yes, even the Almighty can drop a mic. On the wind-swept plateau, Isaiah stood like a stubborn lighthouse, his voice cracking over the cracked earth as if he were narrating the latest episode of a divine reality show. The crowd gathered around the fire, their robes smelling of goat fat and dust, eyes flickering between the ember glow and the prophet's fierce stare. He whispered the ancient covenant in a tone that could make a stone weep, reminding them that judgment had been a bitter medicine, not a permanent poison. A hushed murmur rose, half laughing, half reverent, as someone joked that even the desert camels had a better memory than the people's past sins. Still, the promise of redemption swirled like incense, sweetening the stale night air and stirring the stubborn hearts of the listeners. When Isaiah lifted his hands, the crowd felt an electric jolt, as if someone had plugged the whole valley into a celestial power strip. They stepped forward, palms raw from the sand, and laid down new vows, each word tasting like fresh barley bred after a long famine. The prophet's words turned into a blooming chorus, echoing off stone walls, while the distant city bells chimed a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like a pop song beat. Divine remix, anyone. Laughter cracked the solemn mood. A weary farmer joked that even his stubborn donkey now believed in miracles, and the crowd roared, the sound rolling like thunder over the hills. In that moment, the foretold redemption unfurled, bright as sunrise, turning the once dry plains into a carpet of wildflowers and hopeful sighs. From judgment's cold iron grasp, the people slipped into a warm, relentless tide of God's faithfulness, each wave reshaping their lives with the precision of a master sculptor. The old scars on the ancient walls glistened with fresh rain, a gritty reminder that restoration does not erase pain, but coats it in glistening hope. Children danced barefoot on the newly soft soil, their giggles mixing with the rustle of olive trees swaying to an unseen hymn of peace. Even the stern elders who once muttered like grizzled judges found themselves humming the same tune as the youngsters, their eyes sparkling with a mischievous twinkle that said, "We finally got the memo." And so, the covenant was reborn, not as a fragile parchment, but as an everlasting fire that burned, healed, and illuminated every corner of the nation. The sun stretched like a molten copper sheet across the desert of Judah, scorching the dunes and turning the air into a wavering mirage. Isaiah stood on a crumbling hill, his cloak fluttering as if it were a flag caught in a relentless wind, when a voice like thunder rolled from the heavens, urging him to shepherd a starving caravan. The taste of dust lingered on his tongue, and the scent of baked figs, gone long ago, mocked his hunger. He felt a spark of both dread and purpose ignite in his chest, like a campfire fighting the night's chill. And so, with the divine summons echoing in his ears, he set his gaze toward the wandering silhouettes of traders limping toward ruin. From the shade of a lone olive tree emerged Eliam, a shepherd whose beard smelled of goat milk and wild thyme, carrying a crooked staff that looked like it had auditioned for a fantasy movie prop. He greeted Isaiah with a grin that said, "I've walked more sand than a sandcastle builder on a TikTok binge," and offered a ragged cloak that smelled faintly of sweat and sheep. The caravan, a procession of camels groaning under half-empty sacks, shuddered as the pair stepped forward, the animals' sighs mixing with the wind's whine. Together they divided the last crust of barley, the grain cracking like cheap fireworks beneath their fingers, while the distant horizon flickered with a promise of more drought. Their laughter, ragged and hopeful, rose above the desert's endless sigh, a tiny rebel chant against the looming famine. As the sun began its slow plunge, painting the dunes in blood orange, Isaiah felt the weight of a nation pressing on his shoulders like a sack of millstones. He whispered a prayer to the unseen, his voice cracking like dry twigs, while Eliam clapped a stray sheep onto his back, the animal's wool prickling his skin. Night fell with a chill that slipped under their robes, and the desert sang a chorus of rustling sand and distant howls, reminding them that hope can be as fragile as a candle in a storm. Their feet, blistered and dusty, pressed forward toward an oasis that shimmered only in legend, each step a test of courage and compassion. In that unforgiving silence, the two men learned that true guidance is not just about finding water, but about sharing the fire that keeps the soul from freezing. The caravan snaked across the dunes like a line of ants marching under a blazing sun, each wagon kicking up clouds of grit that stung the eyes. Suddenly, a wall of sand roared toward them, turning the world into a deafening whiteout that swallowed any hope of clear sight. Shadows flickered at the edge of the storm as bandits, half-masked and clutching rusted blades, emerged like unwelcome spoilers in a midnight movie. Isaiah, leaning on his weather-worn staff, raised his voice above the howl, reminding the travelers that fear feeds only the hungry. His words, soft as desert roses, cut through the howling wind and steadied the caravan's wavering hearts. While the storm battered the canvas, Isaiah's counsel wrapped around the men like a warm blanket, urging them to share water and protect one another's flanks. He handed a trembling child a piece of dried fig, and joked that even the desert's Wi-Fi signal was better than the bandits' reception, coaxing uneasy chuckles from the hardened riders. The sand whispered against the canvas, a gritty perfume of ozone and cracked earth, yet the group's rhythm settled into a steady tread, each footfall a promise of solidarity. Even the bandits, bewildered by the caravan's unexpected composure, hesitated, their swords clanking like mistuned guitars in a silent concert. With each compassionate glance Isaiah passed, the desert seemed to loosen its grip, as if the wind itself were listening for a kinder tune. In the chaos, a tent collapsed in a thunder of canvas, pinning a giggling toddler beneath a heap of broken ropes and shredded fabric. Eliam, who had spent most of his life avoiding any spotlight, felt a sudden surge of fire in his chest and lunged toward the wreckage without a second thought. He wrenched the torn canvas apart, the rough fibers scraping his palms like sandpaper, and hoisted the child out. His breath ragged, but his grin fierce as a lion on a meme page. The crowd erupted in cheers, half-hearted and half-relieved, as the rescued infant giggled, oblivious to the ironies of survival in a place where even the sand has a sense of humor. From that moment, Eliam walked taller, his courage stitched into the tapestry of the journey, a living reminder that even the smallest acts can outshine the fiercest storms. The caravan staggered into the volcanic valley, where the sky boiled amber and ash fell like coarse snow. A yawning crater, its lip a ring of fire, spit molten rock that turned the path into a river of glowing sand. Villagers huddled at the rim, eyes wide as if they'd just watched the latest Marvel showdown, but there was no superhero cape in sight. Isaiah's boots thudded on the cracked basalt, each step sending tiny puffs of sulfur into the bitter air. The heat pressed on their necks, and the scent of brimstone mingled with the sour tang of fear. Without a word, Isaiah raised his staff, its tip catching the flare like a bat signal, and shouted a rally that cut through the roar of the eruption. He leapt onto a precarious ledge, tugging terrified children onto his broad shoulders while the ground shivered beneath them. The villagers scrambled, clutching ropes as if they were lifelines from a reality TV escape room, and Isaiah's voice cracked like a seasoned storyteller. He ordered the youngest to fling sandbags over the fissure, sealing the worst of the blast for a few heart-stopping seconds. The rescue turned the valley into a chaotic dance, boots kicking up ash, laughter cracking the tension like a sudden thunderclap. In the choking heat, Eliam's knees trembled, yet his grip on the frail elder was iron steady, a contrast as stark as a silent-mode iPhone in a crowded cafe. He scooped the wounded sage, feeling the crackle of hot ash against his skin, as if the earth itself tried to scorch the hope in his hands. With each staggering step through the molten slurry, the elder muttered a blessing that sounded suspiciously like an old folk tune about fire-baked bread. Isaiah's eyes flickered with a fierce pride, shouting, "Carry on, brave one. This is the kind of fire that forges legends, not just toast." While the valley echoed with their strained breaths. When they finally emerged, the sky cleared to a bruised violet, and Liam, dripping soot, grinned, his courage now as glowing as the furnace they'd survived. The wind howled through the craggy ridge as the caravan crested the summit, a thin veil of clouds hanging like laundry on a line. Below, the valley smelled of pine sap and cold stone, while the sun painted the snow-capped peaks in molten gold. Suddenly, a thunderous roar ripped through the silence as a slab of rock cracked and tumbled down the slope, scattering boulders like drunken marbles. Dust choked the air and the ground shook, trapping the wagons in a canyon of shifting debris. The men clutched their ropes, eyes wide with terror, as the mountain seemed to grin in raw, indifferent power. Isaiah stared at the swirling rocks, his heart thudding like a war drum, and wondered if the Almighty had left the script on the next page. He swallowed his fear, knelt on the grit-slicked earth, and whispered a prayer that sounded more like a frantic text to a distant friend. "Lord, if you're listening, toss us a ladder or at least a decent Wi-Fi signal," he muttered, half joking, half desperate. A sudden hush fell, the wind pausing as if the mountain itself was listening, and a faint rustle of leaves seemed to answer his plea. With trembling hands, Isaiah felt a spark of resolve ignite, his doubts melting like snow under a summer sun. Liam sprang into action, his voice cutting through the chaos like a trumpet blast, shouting orders that rang louder than the clatter of falling stones. He snatched a coil of rope from a shattered cart, tied a makeshift harness, and began pulling the stranded families up the jagged slope with the ingenuity of a seasoned rock climber and the swagger of a reality show host. The rope bit into calloused palms, the smell of sweat and pine mingling as the caravan inched upward, each rescue a gasp of triumph. When the last child was hoisted over the lip of the landslide, a roar of collective relief erupted, echoing off the cliffs like a choir of victorious wolves. In that breathless moment, courage and compassion fused, proof that even the tallest mountain can be tamed by a handful of determined souls. When the dust finally settled, the caravan rolled back toward the familiar hills of home, the scent of pine and burnt pine cones hanging heavy in the wind. Isaiah rode beside the lead mule, his eyes tracing the trail they'd carved through scarred dunes, each pebble a reminder of the night they'd outwitted the marauders. Laughter cracked from the rear, where the youngest scout swapped stories about the great sand monster that turned out to be a misplaced camel's shadow. Ironic, because the real monster was fear itself. The banners they'd hoisted in battle now fluttered lazily, their colors dulled by sun but still bright enough to spark pride. Isaiah let the chorus of clopping hooves and distant river rush settle into his bones, a rhythm of triumph and relief. Liam stepped onto the central stone, his sand-stained cloak brushing the ground like a seasoned actor taking a bow after a wild improv. The crowd, still smelling of smoke and roasted goat, cheered louder than a stadium full of sports fans shouting for the underdog, except this underdog had just saved the day. He raised his right hand, the scar from the siege glinting in the late light, and vowed to walk the path of courage whenever darkness tried to crawl back in. "We'll face the next trial with the same grit," he said, cracking a grin that reminded everyone of the time a goat escaped his tent and led a marching band of goats through the market. The promise rang out, a sturdy rope binding the tribe together, as solid as the oak beams of their long-abandoned watchtower. As the sun slipped behind the ridges, the caravan settled into the familiar courtyard, the smell of fresh figs and damp earth welcoming them home. Isaiah lingered by the fire, feeling the heat kiss his palm, and whispered the lessons of compassion that had sprouted like stubborn weeds amidst the chaos. He recalled the moment a wounded enemy soldier had been tended by a young healer, an irony that made even the oldest war horse grin. The night wrapped the village in a blanket of stars, each twinkle a reminder that courage is not a lone lantern, but a constellation we all share. With every ember fading, hope rose anew, and the saga closed on a note as warm as a grandmother's stew, promising that any future trial will be met with the same bold, compassionate stride.